30 minutes into what was supposed to be the celebration of a decade, the music died. I am Eliza Whitmore, and for 10 years I believed I was the partner of a man defined by his integrity. James Whitmore was a leader, a visionary, a man who spoke of honor as if it were the very air he breathed. But as the ballroom doors swung open on our 10th anniversary, the man I loved walked in holding the hand of his pregnant assistant, Janet. He didn't come to apologize, he came to negotiate. He believed that by bringing his betrayal into the light of a public gala, he could use the weight of my own social standing and the eyes of our elite peers to crush me into a quiet, profitable divorce. He thought my dignity was a weakness he could exploit, a cage that would keep me from making a scene. But James made a fatal mistake. He assumed I was still the woman who believed his lies. He didn't know about the anonymous emails. He didn't know about the forensic accountant I'd hired in the shadows. And he certainly didn't know that the slideshow I prepared for tonight wasn't a trip down memory lane. It was a public execution of his reputation. Before we go back to the beginning, I have to ask, if your husband walked into your anniversary party with a pregnant woman on his arm, would you stay to hear him out, or would you walk out before he could say a single word? James Whitmore didn't just enter a room, he reconfigured it. He had this gravitational pull that made people, intelligent, powerful people, straighten their ties and lower their voices when he arrived. To the outside world, our marriage wasn't just a relationship, it was the Whitmore institution. We were the gold standard of the city's social and professional elite. We met 12 years ago at a charity gala for childhood literacy. I was the lead event planner, a woman who lived by spreadsheets and split-second decisions. James was the keynote speaker. I remember standing in the wings of the stage, watching him adjust the microphone. He didn't look nervous. He looked like he owned the air he was about to speak into. He talked about leadership, not as a rank, but as a moral responsibility. He spoke of integrity with such resonance that I felt it in my marrow. When we finally met at the after-party, he didn't use a pickup line. He asked me about the logistics of the floral arrangements. He had noticed a small detail I'd tucked away in the corner, a specific type of white lily that was my grandmother's favorite. He was intentional. He didn't just look at me, he studied me. He made me feel like the most complex and interesting puzzle he had ever encountered. We dated for 2 years, a whirlwind of high-end dinners, quiet gallery openings, and handwritten notes left on my windshield. He was the steady man. He wasn't flashy or erratic. He was the bedrock. When he proposed in a private garden surrounded by white roses, reading a letter that promised to honor me publicly and privately, I didn't just say yes, I felt like I had finally come home. The first few years of marriage were a masterclass in domestic bliss. We built a life that was as beautiful as it was functional. I left event planning to manage the Whitmore brand, which essentially meant I managed James. I curated his public image, organized his fundraisers, and ensured that our home was a sanctuary that reflected his success. But looking back, the golden cage was being built one quiet brick at a time. The shift was subtle, the kind of change you don't notice until the temperature has already dropped 20 degrees. It started around year 6. James's consulting firm, Whitmore and Associates, began a massive international expansion. Suddenly, late nights at the office weren't an exception, they were the schedule. He became more guarded with his phone. It used to sit open on the nightstand. Now it was always face down or tucked into his pocket even when he went to the bathroom. He began taking investor calls in the garden, his voice a low murmur that stayed just out of my reach. When I asked how his day was, the detailed stories of office politics were replaced by high-level summaries. Busy, Eliza, just a lot of moving parts. I told myself I was being a supportive wife. I told myself that men who carry the weight of 100 employees and millions of dollars in assets deserve a little grace. I didn't want to be the nagging spouse who interrogated her husband over a change in passcode. I believed his silence was just exhaustion. I believed that because he still kissed my forehead every morning and still told me I was the heart of the operation, the foundation was still solid. I didn't realize that I was being systematically moved to the periphery of his life. I was the public wife, the woman who looked perfect in champagne silk at the fundraisers, the woman who handled the social calendar and the holiday cards. But the private James was moving into a different world entirely. By the time our 10th anniversary approached, I was living in a house where the lights were always on, but the music had stopped playing months ago. I was Eliza Whitmore, the woman with the perfect life, the perfect husband, and the perfect home. I was the envy of every woman in our circle. And I was the only person who didn't realize that the man I had built my life around had already moved out of our marriage and into a secret world with a woman named Janet. I was standing in a golden cage admiring the view, completely unaware that the lock had already been turned from the outside. The erosion of a marriage doesn't usually happen in a landslide. It happens in millimeters. It's the way a gaze lingers on a screen a second too long, or the way a conversation that used to flow like a river suddenly hits a dam. For us, the dam was built of business necessity. By year 7, James was no longer just a consultant, he was a ghost who occasionally haunted our dining room. He began traveling to the London and Dubai offices with a frequency that defied logic. When he was home, he was physically present, but mentally miles away. I'd be talking about our plans for the summer, and I'd realize his eyes were fixed on the reflection in the window, his thumb twitching rhythmically against his thigh. A nervous habit he only developed when he was hiding a problem he couldn't solve with a spreadsheet. Then came Janet Ellis. She was hired as his senior executive liaison, a title that sounded impressive but felt hollow. The first time I met her at the company Christmas party, she was the picture of professional deference. She stayed 3 steps behind him, clutching a tablet, her eyes rarely leaving the back of his head. James introduced her with a casual wave of his hand. "She's the engine that keeps the London transition moving, Eliza, sharp as a tack." I remember smiling at her, offering the warm, practiced hospitality of a CEO's wife. I even complimented her blazer. I didn't see a predator. I saw a young, ambitious woman working for a man she clearly admired. But as the months rolled on, Janet's name began to seep into our domestic life like a slow leak. It was no longer "the office called," it was "Janet called." It wasn't "I have a meeting," it was "Janet is prepping the brief for the 8 a.m." The subtle cracks started looking like a pattern. James began stepping into the hallway to answer her calls at 10 p.m. He started locking his home office door, a room that had always been open to me. When I'd knock to bring him coffee, there would be a frantic rustle of papers or the distinct click of a laptop being shut before he'd call out, "Just a second, honey." The intimacy didn't vanish, it changed. It became polite. We had polite dinners where we talked about the weather and the stock market. We had polite sex that felt like a scheduled appointment on a busy calendar. We were functioning, but we were no longer connected. I felt like a stakeholder in a company that was being liquidated behind my back. I remember one night specifically. It was a Tuesday, raining hard against the glass of our bedroom. James was in the ensuite, the shower running. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. I wasn't a snooper, I didn't believe in it, but the vibration was persistent. 3, 4, 5 times. I glanced down. The message on the lock screen read, "The doctor confirmed the date. We need to tell her soon. I can't keep wearing these oversized sweaters, James." The world didn't end in that moment. My heart didn't stop. Instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. I didn't pick up the phone. I didn't scream. I sat back on the edge of the bed and waited for the shower to stop. When James walked out, steaming and smelling of expensive sandalwood soap, he looked at me and smiled that perfect practiced smile. "Everything okay, Eliza? You look a little pale." "Just a headache," I said. And it wasn't a lie. My head was pounding with the sudden, violent weight of the truth. He didn't know I'd seen it. He didn't know the golden cage had just grown its first iron bars. I realized then that I was no longer just his wife. I was a spectator in a game he had been playing for months, and the rules were about to change forever. The morning after I saw that message, I didn't confront him. The old Eliza, the one who believed in the Whitmore integrity, would have screamed. She would have demanded an explanation. But the woman I was becoming in the shadow of that glowing phone screen knew better. If James was a man of strategy, I had to become a woman of logistics. I watched him leave for work that morning, his silk tie knotted perfectly, his briefcase snapping shut with a crisp, final sound. He kissed my cheek, and for the first time in 12 years, I felt a physical recoil I had to suppress. As soon as his car cleared the driveway, I didn't cry. I went to his private study. James prided himself on his digital security, but he had one weakness. He believed I was technologically illiterate. He thought I was content with my gardening blogs and event planning Pinterest boards. He didn't realize that before I became Eliza Whitmore, I was the woman who managed million-dollar corporate budgets and complex logistical chains. I knew where the bodies were buried because I was the one who usually organized the cemetery. I started with the Whitmore and Associates corporate credit card statements. For months I had ignored the minor charges, but now I looked at them with a forensic eye. There were the business dinners at secluded bistros in parts of the city we never frequented. There were the client gifts from high-end maternity boutiques. And then there was the paper trail of the London trips. James had claimed he was staying at the Savoy on corporate business, but the statements showed double occupancy charges. They showed spa treatments for Mrs. Whitmore on dates when I was home in Connecticut hosting a charity brunch. He wasn't just cheating. He was using our shared empire to fund the replacement of me. Then came the anonymous email. It arrived at 2 p.m. that Tuesday. The subject line was blank. Inside were 10 screenshots. They were messages between James and Janet, spanning the last 4 months. James: I'll be at the apartment by 7. Tell the doorman you're with me. Janet: the baby kicked today. He's active just like his father. James: I'm handling the Eliza situation. We just need to get through the anniversary. The optics have to be perfect for the board. The Eliza situation. I whispered the words aloud, and they tasted like ash. I wasn't his partner. I was a situation to be handled, a box to be checked before he could move on to his new, younger life. I spent the next 6 hours downloading every file, every flight manifest, and every deleted email I could recover. I didn't just find an affair. I found a pattern of financial adjustments James had made to the firm's accounts to ensure his personal wealth remained untouched in a potential divorce. He was planning to leave me with a hollowed-out shell of our life while he walked away with the liquid assets. I called Marcus, my cousin and a high-stakes litigator. When he picked up, my voice didn't shake. Marcus, I said, I need the name of the most ruthless forensic accountant in the state, and I need a divorce attorney who treats marriage like a battlefield. Eliza? Marcus's voice was full of concern. What happened? I looked at the photo on the desk, the one of James and me on our wedding day, promising to honor each other. I reached out and turned the frame face down. The music stopped, Marcus, I said, and now I'm going to make sure James is the one who has to pay for the silence. The 3 weeks leading up to our 10th anniversary were the most difficult performance of my life. Every morning I woke up next to a man I now viewed as a hostile entity. I watched him brush his teeth, I listened to him hum in the shower, and I sat across from him at breakfast, nodding along as he discussed the vital importance of our upcoming milestone. 10 years, Eliza, he said one morning, tapping his spoon against his porcelain cup. Most people in our circle don't make it past 5. We're the exception. We're the proof that the system works. I smiled at him over the rim of my coffee. The system is only as good as the people running it, James. He didn't catch the edge in my voice. He was too insulated by his own arrogance. He truly believed he was the architect of my reality. Meanwhile, my logistics team, the attorney Marcus recommended, and a forensic accountant named Sarah were working in a secure digital vault I'd established. Every evening, while James was finishing up a report, likely texting Janet, I was reviewing the trap I was setting. We found it all. The shadow LLC he'd created to siphon off consulting fees, the apartment lease in Janet's name, paid for by Whitmore and Associates, and the medical bills for patient J. Ellis that had been disguised as corporate insurance adjustments. He's not just cheating on you, Eliza, Sarah told me during a late-night encrypted call. He's embezzling from his own partners to build a nest egg for this new family. If this goes public, the board will strip him of everything. Not yet, I whispered. I want him to feel safe. I want him to walk into that ballroom thinking he's the king of the world. The planning of the anniversary party became my cover. I threw myself into the Eliza Whitmore persona, the meticulous, devoted wife. I chose the Grand Aurora Ballroom. I selected the crystal chandeliers that would catch every flicker of movement. I hired a live violinist to play modern love songs in classical arrangements, songs that were once ours, now repurposed as the soundtrack to a funeral. I even sat with James to review the guest list. He insisted on inviting the entire executive board and their spouses. "It's about the optics, Eliza," he argued. "If they see us standing together, solid as ever, it'll calm the nerves about the London merger." "I agree, James," I replied, marking a name off the list with a gold pen. "Optics are everything. We want everyone to see exactly who we are." On the day of the event, the masquerade reached its peak. I spent 4 hours in hair and makeup. I chose a champagne silk dress, the color of celebration, but the texture of armor. When James came home to change, he stopped in the doorway of my dressing room. He looked at me with a flicker of something that might have been old affection, or perhaps just pride in his most valuable asset. "You look incredible," he said, stepping forward to kiss my cheek. I didn't pull away. I let him touch me, feeling the coldness of his wedding ring against my skin. "Tonight is going to be a night no one in this city will ever forget." "I'm counting on it," I said, meeting his eyes in the mirror. As we drove to the ballroom, James reached over and took my hand. His grip was steady, confident. He thought he was walking towards a successful negotiation. He thought he was going to use this night to handle the Eliza situation in front of a hand-picked audience of witnesses. He had no idea that I had already turned his stage into a witness stand. The masquerade was almost over, and the truth was waiting behind the velvet curtains. The Grand Aurora Ballroom was a cathedral of light and sound. I had designed it to be breathtaking, a final monument to the 10 years I was about to incinerate. As we walked through the doors, the violinist began a hauntingly beautiful rendition of a song we'd danced to at our wedding. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the faint metallic tang of chilled champagne. James was in his element. He moved through the crowd like a politician, his hand never leaving the small of my back, a gesture that used to feel like protection, but now felt like a claim of ownership. He laughed with the board members, shook hands with the investors, and accepted the gushing compliments of our friends with a humble, practiced nod. "You've outdone yourself, Eliza," Robert Whitmore, my father-in-law, said as he approached us. He gripped James's shoulder with a pride that made my stomach churn. "To 10 strong years, you two are the bedrock of this family." "To many more," James replied, his voice smooth and untroubled. He clinked his glass against his father's, the sound sharp and clear. I watched him. I watched the way he lied with his whole body. There was no tremor in his hand, no flicker of guilt in his eyes. He was a man who truly believed he could have it all: the legacy, the mistress, the empire, and the perfect wife to keep the seat warm. He was so convinced of his own brilliance that he didn't notice the way my cousin Marcus was positioned near the tech booth, or the way my attorney was standing quietly in the corner, nursing a mineral water. For 30 minutes we played the part. We were the Whitmore institution, a vision of stability in a world of fleeting connections. I accepted the toasts. I smiled for the photographers. I played the role of the devoted architect of his happiness. "I'm just going to step out for a moment to check on the catering," James whispered in my ear around 8:30 p.m. He gave my waist a reassuring squeeze. "Stay right here. I want you front and center for the toast." I watched him walk toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom. I knew where he was going. He wasn't checking on the salmon or the wine. He was going to meet the consequence he had invited to my celebration. The room grew louder, the laughter more boisterous as the champagne took hold. People were happy. They were celebrating a love that didn't exist. I stood alone in the center of the marble floor, the champagne silk of my dress shimmering under the chandeliers, and I felt a strange, cold peace. The countdown had reached 0. The double doors at the entrance didn't just open, they were pushed with a deliberate, theatrical weight. The temperature in the room didn't actually drop, but the atmosphere curdled instantly. The violinist's bow skipped across the strings, a jarring note that cut through the conversation like a scream. One by one, the 28 guests turned. The laughter died in throats. James walked back into his own anniversary party, but this time he wasn't looking at me. He was looking down at Janet Ellis, who was dressed in a soft, loose-fitting wrap dress that did nothing to hide the prominent curve of her stomach. She looked terrified, her hand clutching James's sleeve as if he were her only anchor in a storm. James didn't look ashamed. He looked like a man who truly believed he could have it all: the legacy, the mistress, the empire, and the perfect wife to keep the seat warm. He was so convinced of his own brilliance that he didn't notice the way my cousin Marcus was positioned near the tech booth, or the way my attorney was standing quietly in the corner, nursing a mineral water. For a last time, I danced with my husband at his anniversary party. Beyond that, I had made my plan.
The silence that followed James's voice was heavier than any noise. It was a thick, suffocating vacuum that pulled the air right out of the ballroom. 28 of the most influential people in our lives stood frozen, their champagne glasses suspended like relics of a finished era. I could see my mother-in-law's hand trembling as she reached for her husband's arm. I could see the board members exchanging glances that were already calculating the stock drop. James didn't flinch. He stood there with Janet anchored to his side, his posture as straight as if he were delivering a quarterly earnings report. He wasn't a man caught in a lie. He was a man executing a takeover. "James," I said. My voice was a calm, steady wire cutting through the stillness. "You brought a guest to our anniversary. That's unconventional." "Let's not do this, Eliza," he said, his tone shifting into that negotiator frequency I knew so well. It was the voice he used when he was about to tell a client their company was failing. "You've always prided yourself on being a woman of logic, a woman of reality. This is the reality." He looked down at Janet. She looked like she wanted the marble floor to swallow her whole. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale against the dark fabric of her dress. She wasn't the senior executive liaison tonight. She was the physical evidence of his betrayal. "The reality," James continued, raising his voice so it carried to the back of the room, ensuring every witness heard his honesty, "is that Janet and I have a life together, a life that has grown beyond the confines of what you and I built. She is pregnant, and the baby is mine." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. It was a visceral, ugly sound. James's father, Robert, took a step forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "James, what the hell are you doing? This is your anniversary." "It's an ending, Dad," James said, finally looking at his father, then back to me. "I refuse to live in a house of pretension any longer. I want a divorce, Eliza. I plan to take full responsibility for my child and for Janet. I brought her here tonight because I wanted there to be no ambiguity, no rumors, no shadows." He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a low, predatory murmur intended only to me, though the room was so silent even his breathing felt amplified. "I know you, Eliza. You care about your dignity more than anything. If we handle this quietly, if you sign the papers I've prepared, we can keep the scandal to this room. You get a generous settlement, and you get to keep your pride. If you fight me, you know how messy I can make this." He was using the ballroom as a weapon. He thought by humiliating me in front of the people I respected most, he could force me to retreat into the shadows to lick my wounds. He thought my fear of being the woman who was replaced would outweigh my desire for justice. He stood there, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for the tears, the screaming, the predictable collapse of a woman whose world had just been detonated. I looked at Janet, whose hand was still protectively over her stomach. Then I looked at James, really looked at him. I didn't see the bedrock of my life anymore. I saw a man who had become so addicted to power that he thought he could manage human hearts like assets. "You're right about one thing, James," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face, a smile that made him pause, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing his brow. "But you forgot one thing about optics. They only work if you control the light." I turned my head slightly and nodded toward the tech booth where Marcus was waiting. "Marcus, I think it's time for the real anniversary presentation."
The lights in the ballroom didn't just dim, they vanished, leaving only the glowing white rectangle of the projection screen at the front of the room. James's hand dropped from Janet's arm. He spun around, his brow furrowed in a mix of confusion and irritation. "Eliza, what is this? I told you we're handling this like adults," he snapped, his voice echoing in the hollow silence. "We are, James," I replied from the shadows. "An adult takes responsibility for all their choices, not just the ones they choose to announce." The first image appeared on the screen. It wasn't the wedding photo I had promised. It was a high-resolution screenshot of a bank transfer, $50,000 from the Whitmore and Associates Emergency Operations Fund to a private account held in Janet Ellis's name. A murmur, sharper and more clinical than the previous gasps, cut through the room. These weren't just socialites. These were James's business partners. They knew exactly what emergency operations meant, and it didn't mean maternity leave for an assistant. "That's a lie," James hissed, stepping toward the screen as if he could tear the digital image down with his bare hands. "That's a manipulated document." The image flickered. The next slide was a series of text messages dated 3 months ago during his crucial London merger trip. "James, the penthouse is booked. Eliza thinks I'm at the Savoy. We have 4 days of complete silence. I've moved the consultant fees into the Shell account. You won't have to worry about the nursery costs. Janet, I love the way you take care of us. She has no idea, does she? James, he sees what I want her to see. She's part of the brand, Janet, nothing more." The silence in the room became a physical weight. I watched the executive board members. Their faces were no longer shocked. They were cold. They were looking at a man who wasn't just an adulterer, but a liability. James had used company funds, their funds, to build his shadow kingdom. "Stop it!" Janet cried out, her voice high and thin. She looked at the guests, her eyes wide with a realization that James's protection was a paper shield. The slides moved faster now. Images of hotel receipts from the very weekends James claimed he was working through the night, a lease agreement for a luxury apartment in the city, signed by James as a guarantor, using the firm's corporate address, and finally the medical bills, the ones he had disguised as miscellaneous insurance adjustments. "This is private information," James roared, turning back to me. His composure had finally shattered. The articulate, composed leader was gone, replaced by a man whose secrets were being bled out in front of the very people he spent his life trying to impress. "You had no right to access these files, James. You're finished. I'll have you sued for everything." "I didn't have to break in, James," I said, stepping back into the light. I held up a small silver thumb drive. "You left the door open years ago when you started believing your own lies. You thought I was an ornament. You forgot that I was the one who set up the accounting software for your firm when you were still working out of our garage." I looked at the board members. "He didn't just betray me. He's been siphoning off your dividends to pay for a life he wasn't man enough to afford on his own. He brought Janet here tonight to humiliate me, so I would be too ashamed to fight for what's mine. He wanted a quiet exit." I turned to James, whose face was a mask of pale, sweating fury. "There is nothing quiet about the truth, James, and there is nothing left for you to manage."
James took a step toward me, his chest heaving, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a single friendly face. But the ballroom had transformed. His peers, the men he had golfed with and the women I had lunched with, had pulled back, forming a literal circle of exclusion. He was no longer the centerpiece of the evening. He was the specimen under a microscope. "You think this changes the math?" James hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "You think a few leaked emails give you the upper hand? I built Whitmore and Associates. I am the brand. You're just a beneficiary who got lucky 12 years ago." I didn't answer him with words. I signaled to Marcus, who stepped forward from the shadows of the tech booth. He wasn't carrying a drink anymore. He was carrying a heavy leather briefcase. He walked with the measured, rhythmic pace of a man who had already won the race before the starting gun even fired. "Actually, James," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension like a gavel, "we've already done the math, and the numbers don't look good for you." Marcus opened the briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers bound in blue legal backing. He didn't hand them to James. He handed them to Robert Whitmore, James's father and the majority stakeholder in the firm's holding company. "What is this, Marcus?" Robert asked, his voice gravelly and pained. "It's a petition for the immediate freezing of all shared marital assets and a motion for a forensic audit of the firm's discretionary spending," Marcus explained, not once looking away from James. "But more importantly, it's a copy of the divorce filing I lodged with the court 2 weeks ago. Eliza was granted an ex parte order on Tuesday. As of 4 p.m. today, James, you have been legally barred from transferring, selling, or encumbering any asset worth over $500. James's face went from a heated red to a sickly translucent white. 2 weeks? You've been sitting on this for 2 weeks. "I wanted to give you the anniversary you deserved," I said, my voice cold and melodic. "I wanted to make sure that when the truth came out, there were plenty of witnesses to your honesty. You see, James, you relied on my silence to protect your reputation. You assumed I would be too humiliated to let the board see the cracks. You calculated that I would value the Whitmore name more than my own justice." I stepped closer until I was just inches away from him. Janet had retreated several feet, looking like she was realizing for the first time that the powerful man she had hitched her life to was currently drowning in a sea of his own making.
I filed for divorce because our marriage ended the moment you decided my life was a situation to be handled. But I waited until tonight to serve you because I wanted everyone to see the disciplined, visionary leader for what he really is, a thief who steals from his partners and a coward who hides behind a pregnant woman." Robert Whitmore looked up from the papers, his eyes hard as flint. He looked at his son, not with anger, but with a profound, soul-deep disappointment. "The board meets tomorrow at 8 a.m. Don't bother coming to the office. Your key card has already been deactivated." The silence that followed was the sound of a kingdom collapsing. James reached out to grab the table for support, his hand brushing against a crystal vase of white roses, the same roses he had used to propose. He knocked it over. The glass didn't shatter, but the water spilled across the table, soaking into the silk tablecloth and dripping on his expensive Italian shoes. He was the architect of his own ruin, and for the first time in 10 years, he had absolutely nothing to say.
The sound of water dripping from the table onto the marble floor was the only rhythm left in the room. It was slow, steady, and final. The sound of a clock running out. James didn't move. The man who had spent a decade practicing the art of the unshakable posture was now a hollowed-out version of himself. His suit, which had looked like armor an hour ago, now just looked like an oversized costume. Janet stood by the buffet table, her hand resting on her stomach, looking at the door. She wasn't looking at James with love. She was looking at him with the dawning realization that the man she had banked her future on was no longer a king. She had seen the board members walk away. She had seen his father disown him with a single sentence. She was tethered to a sinking ship, and the weight of that reality was visible in the way her shoulders sagged. "I'm leaving, James," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the emptiness of the ballroom it carried like a bell. He finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his face etched with a frantic, desperate calculation that was failing him for the first time. "Eliza, wait, we can talk about this. The board, they'll listen to you if you tell them this was a private matter, that we're working it out." "I'm not a crisis manager, James," I interrupted, my voice devoid of heat. "I'm the woman you tried to bury, and I'm done digging." I reached up and began to unfasten the pearls around my neck, the ones he had given me for our 5th anniversary. I placed them on the damp silk of the tablecloth next to the overturned roses. Then I slowly slid the 10-carat diamond off my left hand. For 10 years that ring had felt like a part of my body. Now it just felt like a cold piece of carbon. I set the ring down on top of the legal papers. It sparkled under the crystal chandeliers, a beautiful, expensive lie. "You said you promised to honor me publicly and privately. You failed the private part years ago, and tonight I've taken care of the public part for you." "You've destroyed everything," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Everything we built, the firm, the house, the name. What do you have now? You're just alone." "I'm not alone, James," I said, stepping closer to the door, feeling the cool air from the hallway hitting my back. "I'm free. There's a difference." I turned to Janet. She flinched as my gaze landed on her. I didn't feel the urge to scream at her. I didn't feel the need to blame her for the choices of a grown man. I simply felt a weary, distant pity. "Janet," I said quietly, "he told me I was part of the brand. He told you that he'd take care of you. Just remember, James only protects things he thinks he can control. The moment you stop being an asset, you become a situation to be handled. Good luck with your new life. You're going to need it."
I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't look at the board members who were lingering near the bar, waiting for the scandal to move to the next phase. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. With every step, the weight that had been pressing on my chest for 3 weeks lifted. The golden cage wasn't just open, I had burned the house around it. As I reached the double doors, I paused one last time. I looked back at the ballroom, the ivory tablecloths, the gold-accented plates, the hundreds of white roses. It looked like a graveyard, and in the center of it all sat the man who thought he could have it all, clutching a handful of damp legal papers and staring at a ring that no longer belonged to anyone. I pushed the doors open and walked out into the night.
The air outside the Grand Aurora Ballroom was cold, but it felt like the first clean breath I had taken in a decade. I didn't call a car, I didn't wait for Marcus. I just walked, my champagne silk dress catching the streetlights, until the sounds of the party, the muffled music, the clinking of glasses, the whispers, were nothing more than a ghost in the wind. By 5 a.m. I was sitting on the terrace of a small apartment I had rented in secret a week ago. It wasn't a penthouse, it didn't have marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It was quiet, it was mine, and it smelled of nothing but fresh paint and possibility. I watched the horizon turn from a bruised purple to a pale, hopeful gold. The Whitmore institution was headline news by now, I'm sure. The board would be meeting in 2 hours to officially strip James of his title. The legal machines were grinding into motion, and within months the name Whitmore would be a footnote in a scandal rather than a pillar of the community. But for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't thinking about the brand. I wasn't thinking about the optics. I thought about the young woman I was 12 years ago, the one who fell for a man who spoke of integrity because she wanted to believe in something solid. I didn't hate her for being tricked. I realized that her capacity to believe was her greatest strength. James's inability to be worthy of that belief was his greatest failure. He hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost the only person who truly saw the man he was supposed to be. My phone buzzed on the table. A text from Marcus. The restraining order is served. He's out of the house. Sarah found another offshore account. We've got him, Eliza. All of him. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I just felt finished. Betrayal is a violent teacher. It strips you of your comfort, your history, and your sense of safety. But in the wreckage, it reveals a fundamental truth. You are not the things that were done to you. You are the person who decides what happens next. James tried to use my life as a prop in his own drama, but he forgot that I was the one who knew how to build the stage. As the sun finally broke over the edge of the world, flooding the city with light, I realized that the golden cage had never really been about James. It was about my own fear of being seen as less than perfect. The night he tried to humiliate me, he inadvertently gave me the greatest gift of my life, the permission to be messy, to be angry, and to be real. I am Eliza, not Eliza Whitmore, just Eliza. The story of my marriage ended in a ballroom filled with strangers and lies, but the story of my life is just reaching the first chapter, and this time I'm the only one holding the pen.
10 years of loyalty dismantled in 30 minutes. Eliza's story reminds us that dignity isn't something someone can take from you. It's something you reclaim when the truth finally comes to light. When someone tries to use your silence as a shield for their lies, remember that the truth is a weapon that only works for those brave enough to hold it.
If Eliza's strength inspired you, or if you've ever had to turn the tables on someone who underestimated you, let us know by typing "New Beginning" in the comments. We listen to every single story you share. Thank you for listening to this story on echoes of trust and betrayal. If this narrative moved you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel for more, and share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your power. Your worth is not up for negotiation. We'll see you in the next one.